Good evening, everybody, because it's evening now in England and getting dark. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Good. I'm honored to have been invited by the Dupuy Institute to talk to this conference. I did have the pleasure nearly 40 years ago of meeting Colonel Trevor Dupuy, and I remember him with great respect and affection. But I'm very conscious that my own qualifications are in engineering and in economics, and my professional experience is in aircraft research and cost effectiveness analysis. So I'm not a professional historian, nor am I a soldier. However, I do have a long-standing amateur interest in military history, and that has led me into the analysis which I'll present today. Can I have the second slide, Chris? First one is just the title, then the second one.
Is this yours?
No, that's mine.
No.
That's Dr. McKay's.
All right, let's see what presentation is that, Chris?
You have to pull up the stick. Go up one. Go to final presentations. And D Kirkpatrick presentation, the second one down. Sorry, we're not properly prepared for you.
That's okay.
We're too busy having lunch.
Well, I only had tea in the interval.
How important are superior numbers? David Kirkpatrick. Second slide coming up shortly.
Let me share that with him so he can see what we see.
And what? I can only see the conference room at the moment.
Right. Now you should see your slides.
I got the first slide, but we'll go on to the second one because that's just the title. Great. So I probably don't need to tell you that national leaders have always struggled to strike the right balance between quality and quantity in their armed forces. In the classical and medieval period, the decisive fighting in land battles was a series of hand-to-hand duels between the warriors in the front ranks of the opposing army, and the numbers in the rear ranks were of relatively little importance. At sea, warships became progressively larger as naval commanders appreciated their advantages in combat. So quality was important also at sea. In modern times, this dilemma persists, and governments with limited budgets must acknowledge that there's a trade-off between quality and quantity. Numerous but poorly armed forces generally suffer bloody defeat, while small forces, however well equipped and expensively trained, can be disproportionately depleted by accidents and unserviceability, are vulnerable to surprise attack, are unable to counter dispersed threats, and incur diseconomies of small scale. Though the chosen balance between quality and quantity in different nations may be set by political and cultural traditions, reinforced by institutional inertia, and also influenced by pressure from military or industrial interest groups defending their cap badges or their profit margins. Ideally, the balance should be set after rigorous cost-effectiveness studies, taking account of the threats to a nation's security and to its vital interests, and on its commitments to its allies. The ideal balance maximizes national security within a limited budget. It's particularly difficult to set the right balance when military technologies are advancing rapidly and when the geopolitical situation is in flux. In such challenging times, decision makers often cling to well-established aphorisms, such as the importance of superior numbers, as drowning men clutch at straws. Next slide, please. Victory in any particular land battle can be judged either by its immediate outcome or its longer-term strategic political consequences. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 can be regarded as a tactical draw, but the subsequent retreat of the Confederate Army signaled the failure of its invasion of Union territory, thus discouraging Anglo-French intervention and providing a favorable political environment for the Emancipation Proclamation. The Prussian army at Gravelotte, 1870, suffered nearly double the number of the French, but after the battle, the French army retreated into the fortress of Metz, where it was cut off from resupply and ultimately capitulated. The immediate outcome of a battle can be assessed in terms of relative losses of personnel or in terms of vital terrain won or lost. Either of these criteria can determine the opponent's ability to continue the war. This analysis of the effect of superior numbers focuses on the loss ratios in land battles rather than on the logistical or psychological consequences of the battles. Next one, please. It's difficult to assess the effect of superior numbers in the classical and medieval period because there's little credible data on the army's strength and losses. In those periods, the decisive fighting was done, as I said a moment ago, as a series of hand-to-hand duels between the warriors in the front ranks. And the outcome depended on the relative quality of those opposing warriors, that is to say, on their combat skills, their weapons, and their armor, rather than on the numbers in the rear ranks behind them. It followed that Greek hoplites or Roman legionnaires could generally defeat any number of barbarian enemies. In the medieval period and sometimes earlier, battles could be won by a charge of armored cavalry whose success depended on the ability of the individual cavalryman and on the weight of his war horse. Throughout most of military history, up to the widespread adoption of gunpowder weapons, victory in land battles was determined primarily by the relative quality of the opposing soldiers and their commanders, and the effect of superior numbers, if any, is obscure. It's also difficult to identify the effect of superior numbers in modern land battles, because the strength of a modern army cannot be represented by the arithmetical total of its personnel. Battalions within a modern army operate a wide variety of weapons and benefit from air support. It is possible, as Dr. Lucas explained earlier, to estimate for each of the Army's weapon systems and supporting aircraft a lethality index incorporating several of that system's characteristics. The lethality indices can then be combined with the Army's order of battle to estimate the Army's combat power, and this estimate can be modified by environmental and other factors. But even when the current ratio of combat power of the opposing armies can be estimated, the daily losses of the defeated force are often unknown or obscured by propaganda, so no clear relationship between loss ratio and combat power can be confidently defined. However, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the armies of developed nations had only three combat powers, combat arms: infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and these were normally deployed in similar proportions and were armed with similar weapons. It's therefore reasonable to represent the combat power of such armies by the total number of their personnel, though ideally combat power should take account of any disproportionate strength or weakness in any one of the three combat arms. In this period, there are credible, albeit approximate, data on the numbers in the opposing armies and their losses in battle. Even in these centuries, it's difficult to identify the effect of superior numbers. It's undesirable to combine the data from different wars involving different pairs of armies because the effect of superior numbers could be obscured by the disparate combat performance of several armies involved. But any single war may have too few battles to form an adequate database. Furthermore, the strength ratios in these battles are generally close to unity, since an outnumbered general often chose to retreat rather than to fight at a disadvantage. Dr. Lucas, next slide, please. Dr. Lucas has discussed numerous attempts to identify the importance of superior numbers and the variety of results they obtained. There have also been at least 2 studies of major battles of the American Civil War based on Livermore's data published in 1901. As an example, my 1985 study, next slide please, shows the variation of loss ratio and strength ratio for 16 major battles in the American Civil War. This sample excludes assaults on fortified lines, in which the loss ratios were dominated by the strength of the fortifications, and also excludes battles where there were disproportionately large numbers of missing, distorting the loss ratios. These data, I hope you agree, show no particular relationship between loss ratio and strength ratio. Next slide, please. Dr. Lucas has already presented Lanchester's laws, so I won't labor over this slide. I have addressed only the law relevant to aimed firepower, known as the square law. Early in the 20th century, Lanchester formulated a combat model of modern warfare, describing either a land battle between deployed firing lines of infantry or a naval battle between opposing warships. This combat model suggests, as my 3rd bullet shows, that other things being equal, the blue force will be victorious if the product of the blue unit effectiveness times the square of the numbers of blue units present is greater than the corresponding red values. However, if the morale of the red force can tolerate a higher level of attrition, then other things are not equal and either force might win. But it's always been tempting for politicians and journalists to ignore this caveat and to relate the strength of a military force directly to the square of its numbers. It's also been tempting to ignore the important assumption inherent in Lanchester's combat model that all forces present are in effective action during the battle. In practice, some may be held in reserve and others may arrive late. Next slide, please. When Lanchester's square law was published, it was immediately popular. It appeared to provide a respectable mathematical justification for a traditional military maxim promulgated by Voltaire and Napoleon that superior numbers were the key to victory and that it was important to assemble all available troops for a decisive battle. Generals were delighted by the square law's support for large forces and hence for a large military hierarchy. Contemporary admirals were less impressed. They had always believed in the gunpowder age that the combat power of individual sailing ships and their crews was more important than the relative size of the opposing fleets, and British admirals were almost always prepared to accept battle against superior numbers. They had observed in the 19th century, before Lanchester, that an ironclad warship like CSS Virginia could easily defeat wooden ships of the line, and that in the 20th century, they realized that pre-dreadnought battleships and armored cruisers were no match for post-1905 dreadnoughts. In 1914, a British admiral with 4 armored cruisers declined to engage a single German dreadnought battlecruiser, and his decision was upheld by the subsequent court-martial, which accepted the relative number of warships present was virtually irrelevant. At sea, quality was always supremely important. Despite the Admiral's skepticism, Lancaster's Square Law allowed politicians to glorify in the scale of their armed forces without worrying overmuch about their equipment. The Square Law also strengthened Democrats' belief in a numerous militia, ideally well regulated, or in a levée en masse, which certainly yielded large numbers, though not necessarily well motivated. Many accepted the Square Law principle that superior numbers were supremely important without fully understanding the caveats or without requiring any supporting evidence. Plausible theories in economics, education, and other social sciences, similarly unsupported by evidence, have also been welcomed unreservedly by public opinion. Next slide, please. The American Civil War is particularly suitable for a new and more rigorous analysis of the variation of loss ratios with strength ratios, because American Civil War armies were almost homogeneous. A very large proportion of a typical army was infantry, and infantry inflicted a very large proportion of the enemy's losses, except in some few cases which were particularly favorable to artillery. Hence, the numerical strength of an American Civil War army is a good approximation of its combat power, and it's possible to avoid the difficulties of estimating the combat power of armored fighting vehicles and support aircraft. The American Civil War is also suitable because it featured many open field battles, even excluding small-scale skirmishes where the loss ratios could be determined by chance events or local topography. Furthermore, the American Civil War has been extensively studied, and there are abundant and reasonably credible data. Next slide, please. But there are inevitably difficulties with American Civil War data. Some post-battle reports of losses were incomplete because the officers had other priorities, and some were biased by wishful thinking of commanders. Some strength estimates did not adequately account for straggling. The missing could be prisoners, wounded or unwounded, or deserters during the retreat of a defeated army. Some battle data covered several days fighting, combining the results of engagements which are separated in time and space and which had different values of strength and loss ratios. Next slide, please. This analysis took explicit account of Lancaster's assumption that all troops in the opposing armies were able to effect losses on their enemies. It therefore estimated the strengths of the opposing armies in terms of numbers effectively engaged, excluding those present who were unarmed or who were retained in reserve throughout the battle. In battles where one or more armies received large reinforcements during an engagement, this analysis estimated a time averaged value of the strength ratio as accurately as the records allowed. To identify the effect of superior numbers, this analysis also excluded battles in which the loss ratio were affected by other factors such as fortifications, training, and surprise. It's evident that the loss ratio of an American Civil War battle could be affected by an improvised field work, such as a trench, a log breastwork, or even piled knapsacks, or by a regular fortification built in advance to resist siege or assault. American Civil War data shows that the losses sustained by troops attacking prepared or improvised defense were notably higher than those of the defenders, and that the loss ratios defended principally on the strength of the defenses rather than on the strengths of the opposing forces. In the American Civil War, the individual effectiveness of defendants was typically 5 to 10 times the attackers. And in the First World War, when fortifications were even more sophisticated, the effectiveness ratio could be nearly 100 to 1. And Dr. Lucas' earlier presentation highlighted the effects of fortification in the first days of the Battle of Kursk. In most American Civil War battles, the opposing armies had comparable levels of training and experience. At the start, they were all green together, and they accumulated combat skills in parallel. But at Richmond, Kentucky, in 1862, a force of Confederate veterans routed a similar number of Union recruits. And the loss ratio in that battle indicated that the veterans' individual effectiveness was more than 10 times that of the recruits. Similar effectiveness ratios can be found in the wars of the French Revolution. Accordingly, the Battle of Richmond was excluded from this analysis. It's also true that troops taken by surprise tended to suffer disproportionate losses until they could be deployed to engage the enemy effectively. So the engagements at Chancellorsville on the 2nd of May, 1863, and at Cedar Creek on the 19th of October, 1864, were also excluded. It's entirely possible that some of the land battles were affected by differences in morale, weaponry, and leadership. Both the Confederate and Union armies generally sustained high morale and motivation until their ranks were diluted by conscripts and bounty jumpers towards the end of the war. Both armies adopted similar rifled muskets and artillery as rapidly as possible. The Confederacy had an inadequate industrial base and had more difficulty in obtaining weapons, so Confederate armies probably had a small but reasonably consistent disadvantage in firepower. The quality of leadership in both armies varied considerably. Some general officers had been trained at West Point and had risen to their elevated responsibilities. Other generals were incompetents appointed through nepotism or political influence. It was tempting to exclude battles involving substandard generals, but that cull would have required some very arbitrary judgments and would have depleted the database unacceptably. Accordingly, it was assumed that these factors, morale, weaponry, and generalship, would not significantly affect the loss ratios in the battle considered. So for American Civil War battles which were not affected by fortification, training, or surprise, this analysis updated strength and loss estimates in accordance with modern research, and it disaggregated battle data which covered several days or different locations to focus on bounded engagements which had reasonably representative strength and loss ratios. For example, I've included only the first day at Shiloh before major Union reinforcements arrived, and I've distinguished between the engagements at Seven Pines and Fair Oaks, which were fought on the same day, but a considerable distance apart. Can I have the next slide, please? The resulting data for 28 open field battles are presented in this slide, which suggests that the loss ratios in these battles were indeed inversely proportional to the ratio of strengths engaged, exactly as predicted by Lanchester's square law. The plotted points are scattered along the trend line because of the particular circumstances of each battle. A physicist might be dissatisfied by this imperfect correlation, but an economist would regard it as completely convincing. In two of the outlying land battles, Fair Oaks and Malvern Hill, the Union force had an unusual superiority in artillery. And for those two battles, a more detailed analysis should ideally account for that superiority and increase the Union over Confederate strength ratio accordingly to reflect better the relative combat powers of the opposing armies. If we believe Confederate General D.H. Hill that half the Confederate losses at Malvern Hill were caused by artillery, then Union combat power would be approximately doubled and the Malvern Hill point would move to the right, much closer to the trend line. All of the historical data, as has been brought out in earlier presentations, all historical data which appears in memoirs and histories are estimates compiled by humans and are prone to inaccuracy and bias. Sometimes the original estimates can be improved by later research, but they remain estimates. Each one of the points plotted in this figure may include errors either in the immediate post-battle reports, in the selective memory of participants, in the historian's later assembly of data for publication, and in the judgment of any subsequent analysts, including myself. But I believe that amending a few points in figure 2 would not alter the overall trend of the data. Next slide, please. To demonstrate that the American Civil War result was not an anomaly, it was appropriate to consider the strength and loss ratios in battle in earlier and later wars. However, some of these wars were short and contained too few battles to form a useful database, or were fought between armies with diverse contingents, including regular and irregular troops with very different combat capabilities. 6 wars or campaigns were chosen to supplement the preceding analysis of battles of the American Civil War, running through the 18th century up to the 19th. Next slide, please. In the 4 wars before the American Civil War, the Army's infantry were equipped with smoothbore muskets with shorter range and poorer accuracy than the rifles used in the American Civil War. So in these earlier wars, cavalry and infantry were more important. The strength of an army in these wars should ideally be represented by a synthesis of the numbers of horse, foot, and guns, rather than a single total. But in practice, analysis must rely on a single total. In earlier wars, cavalry sometimes had the opportunity to make devastating charges on the battlefield and was often able to harass the retreat of a defeated army. In such pursuits, the unmotivated soldiers in a dynastic war tended to surrender in large numbers, distorting the loss ratios. Next slide, please. In the 7 Years' War, the Prussians were opposed by Austrian, French, and Russian armies, which had significantly different characteristics. Accordingly, this analysis focused on the 7 open field battles between the Prussian and Austrian armies. The exchange ratios for these battles are scattered, and Leuthen is an outlier, which could be attributed to the surprise achieved by Frederick the Great's pre-battle maneuvers, but most are broadly in accordance with the square law. The results suggest that the individual effectiveness of the Austrians was slightly less than that of the Prussians. Next, please. Napoleon's campaigns in 1805 to 1807 were conducted by a supremely competent army, which was inspired by revolutionary patriotism, was led by field and general officers appointed on merit, was organized in several all-arms army corps, and which had been well trained in the camps around Boulogne in 1803 to 1805. This army fought several battles against Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies, which were all organized in more or less the same obsolescent structures and commanded by aristocrats of limited ability. This figure shows that the variation of loss ratio with strength ratio in 7 open field battles broadly followed the trend predicted by the square law. There are 2 particular outliers. In the encounter battle of Auerstadt on the bottom left, the Prussians were particularly ineptly commanded. And in the Battle of Eylau, which I apologize is not labeled, but is on the horizontal axis, just a little bit to the left of the vertical axis. In the Battle of Eylau, the relatively high French losses may be attributed to the adverse effects of an untimely snowstorm, which disrupted a French attack. The results of these battles showed that the individual effectiveness of the French soldiers in the Grande Armée was about double that of their opponents. Next, please. During the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal in 1808 to 13, the performance of the Spanish armies was very variable. They were often poorly armed, ill-trained, incompetently commanded, and lacked effective cavalry. Consequently, the results of Franco-Spanish battles varied widely, obscuring the effects of strength ratio, and so they're excluded from this analysis. Instead, I focused on the battles between French and British armies, though recognizing that in the latter stages of the war, British armies included Portuguese and Spanish contingents. For this particular analysis, the loss ratios in two battles, Albuera and Salamanca, were amended to exclude the losses resulting from particularly devastating cavalry charges, which are inconsistent with Lancaster's combat model based on firepower. Excluding Buzaco on the top right, where the British defended exceptionally advantageous terrain, this figure shows that the results of 8 battles were broadly in accordance with the square law and suggests that the individual effectiveness of British soldiers was about double that of the French. The difference may be attributed to the French over-reliance on massed columns of attack. Next one, please. Napoleon's 1813 campaign in Germany was fought between French and Allied armies, which had all been reconstructed after the losses of the 1812 campaign in Russia and after the defeats of Prussia and Austria in 1806 and 1809. In some battles, inexperienced conscripts surrendered in large numbers, unrelated to the strength and firepower of the opposing armies. Their surrenders distorted the loss ratios, so these battles were excluded from the analysis. This figure shows that for most of the battles with credible data, the loss ratios are indeed in accordance with the square law. In the particular case of Luckau, the Prussians had the advantage of very favorable terrain. The values of the individual effectiveness of the soldiers in the opposing armies was about equal. And the next one, please. The 7 Weeks' War between Austrians and Prussians included 5 corps-level battles at the frontiers and 1 larger battle between the main armies. For all these battles, the analysis took account, where practicable, of the variations in the strength ratios as reinforcements arrived, and deducted from the Austrian losses in the main battle the soldiers who were drowned after the battle during the Austrian retreat. This figure shows that most of the ratios of strengths engaged were very close to unity. So the battle outcomes don't provide conclusive support for Lancaster's square law. However, I think it's important to include those outcomes to show how inferior weapons, unwise tactics, and incompetent commanders together reduce the individual effectiveness of the Austrians to about 1/5 of the effectiveness of the Prussians. Next one, please. The Franco-Prussian War lasted for 8 months, but this analysis focused only on the early battles in August and September 1870 between the Prussians and the French imperial armies. Later battles involved improvised French Republican armies with very variable levels of morale, leadership, training, and equipment, all of which obscured the effects of strength ratio. The strength data in this war presented particular problems. The Prussian doctrine of marching to the sound of guns meant that the Prussian strength increased considerably during the course of a battle. Conversely, the French tactical doctrine was defensive. When a French army corps encountered the enemy, it deployed in a good position and waited to be attacked. Consequently, the number of French soldiers engaged was often considerably less than the number on the battlefield, especially at Vionville-Mars-la-Tour. The French losses were reduced where appropriate to exclude those incurred in gallant but futile cavalry charges. In the 7 battles in August and September, the loss ratios of Wissembourg and Gravelotte were affected by French fortifications, and the French at Sedan deployed in a particularly unfavorable position, described by General Ducrot as a chamber pot. This shows that the results of the other 4 battles are broadly consistent with Lanchester's square law. 4 battles don't really provide for an adequate database, but this war was included to assess and explain the apparent anomalous loss ratios in the other 3 battles, Gravelotte, Wissembourg, and Sedan. Next slide, please. I think that this analysis demonstrates conclusively that in open field battles of the American Civil War, there was a direct relationship between loss ratios and strength engaged ratios of the opposing armies. Furthermore, the loss ratio was inversely proportional to the ratio of strength engaged. This result validates Lanchester's combat model when correctly applied in this scenario, and validates the square law derived from it. The result also endorses President Lincoln's advice to his generals that they should, quote, put in all your men, unquote, and stresses the importance of decisive leadership and effective command and control, which were able to bring all available troops into action. None of the 6th, 18th, and 19th century wars considered in this analysis provides conclusive evidence for the validity of Lanchester's combat model, but their loss ratios were broadly consistent with Lanchester's square law. The research supporting this analysis showed that the loss ratios in land battles could be very significantly affected by other battles, in addition to superiority of numbers. These factors included fortifications, weaponry, training, tactical doctrine, and surprise. Any general assessing his chance of victory in a forthcoming battle should take account of all relevant factors, including morale and motivation, which are always essential to victory. These other factors often overshadow the effects of superior numbers. Next slide, please. Since the adoption of gunpowder weapons, it's been widely believed that larger armies were generally victorious. Unbounded praise was lavished on generals like Frederick the Great and Napoleon, who won battles despite fielding fewer troops than the enemy. Unfortunately, this simplistic faith in superior numbers tends to have endured into the 20th century and appears to have sometimes distorted national policies and military planning. For example, in the early 20th century, Germany was fearful of the scale of the huge Russian army and was prepared in 1914 to launch a very risky preventative war before the Russian army got even bigger. France in the 1930s preferred to rely on a large conscript army rather than create elite armored divisions, and we know how that ended. In the late 1930s, the United States Army constrained the footprint of the M4 Sherman so that larger numbers could be shipped to overseas theaters of operations. And in 1940, some RAF commanders believed that aerial battles could best be won by assembling several squadrons in a big wing before engaging the Luftwaffe. In practice, World War II aerial battles were an accumulation of short engagements between two opponents, a succession of duels, really. Doubtless, many other flawed decisions have been made behind closed doors, and they remain concealed to exonerate the guilty. Next slide, please. While Lancaster's square law was neither validated nor refuted, this simplistic law remained attractive. It appeared to offer some easily understood guidance to help national leaders resolve the enduring quality-quantity dilemma. But I hope this analysis has shown that the square law is valid, but only when correctly applied in terms of forces engaged in battles which are decided by massed firepower rather than by a succession of duels, which involve reasonably homogeneous forces where strength roughly equals combat power, and which have similar weapons, training, morale, etc., and which are not affected by any factors, extra factors such as fortifications, weaponry, or surprise. These conditions occurred principally in the American Civil War and less exactly in other contemporary wars. In other historical periods and in other scenarios, Lancaster's square law can be misleading, and it should not be applied indiscriminately. Thank you for listening. Last slide. Everybody still there?
Yeah. I think everyone's absorbing what you just said.
I'll just speak up, right? So maybe one small point about some of this is, you often show a picture and then it'll have some outliers in it. And then you can look at the outlier and you can tell a story about it and, try to understand, okay, well, there's a reason why it's there, and, the story makes a certain amount of sense. But, let's say if you then looked at the data and discovered, oops, actually, I mislabeled that outlier. It was a different battle. That was just a data entry error. It wasn't actually an outlier. You could also come up with a good story. If it wasn't battle A, it was battle B. Now we look at battle B and we say, oh yeah, makes sense why battle B is up there. Whereas a minute ago you might have been saying, it makes sense that battle A is up there. Or if you discovered, the mistake, suddenly the story that you told, it was a good sounding story, but actually doesn't apply anymore. I'm not suggesting that explodes all of this, but I just think we should be a little bit cautious about those stories that are told after we see something puzzling like that.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and I would certainly accept that one ought to look equally scrupulously at all the data rather than just at the outliers. I think we could probably all agree that there are numerous factors which would drive the loss ratio in addition to superiority of numbers. I think it was said earlier, perhaps by Dr. Lucas, that all battles are different, and perhaps they are. And for that reason, any data that you look at is going to be scattered. I think if you were to look at the data and have some outliers, you might accept that the theory, well, the model was incorrect. But if you can reasonably suggest explanations as to why the outliers are indeed outliers, then I think the correlation becomes more plausible.
My paper, I'm Bob Helmwood. My paper on Wednesday will extend and refine those results considerably. And I will be using a much larger database of battles, covering a wider range of time dates. So anybody who's interested in this presentation will be interested in mine. Thank you.
If I've understood you correctly, Robert, you're suggesting I use a wider data set. I could use a wider data set for the American Civil War by including smaller scale skirmishes, but these tend to be affected more by a particular incident or feature of topography or a single decision by a single commander, and therefore they're even more scattered than the major battles which I have included. I think if I were to stretch the analysis across several wars, I would merely confuse the situation more because of the great disparity between the individual effectiveness of different armies. I was relieved to discover before I presented it to an American audience that the ratio of individual effectiveness between Confederate and Union troops was about the same. But as I pointed out, the effectiveness of the Austrians in the 7 Weeks' War was abysmal because they had inferior weaponry, inferior leadership, inferior tactics. Everything was wrong. So I would be very reluctant to mix together different wars involving many different armies. I've been sort of dragged into it in looking at these other 6 campaigns, which are not as well bounded as the American Civil War, but I felt it was necessary to address some other wars to demonstrate that the American Civil War result was not an anomaly, was not obviously an anomaly.
I think Doug had his hand up
In
next.
my case, I'm using a database of 300 battles, spanning about 400 years of time. And I'm looking not only at the key to victory in combat, but also on the time trends over those 400 years, which is very surprising in many ways.
Well, I don't find examples stretching over several centuries to be particularly convincing because so many things have changed or are changing in that period that I think any quote lesson unquote from that has got to be rather dubious.
Well, obviously, I beg to differ. And I will be happy to make my presentation and hear any comments.
Well, we can certainly beg to differ, and that's part of the joy of having discussions between people who can view this problem from different perspectives. I think one of my main interests in the whole affair of Lancaster is why it was so unreservedly accepted at the time it was published and continued to be accepted right through the 20th century up to some Cold War analysis, which was going on in the US and in the UK and probably in other places as well. The willingness of humans to accept what they want to believe is quite incredible, really, to us.
All right, Doug, I think you had your hand up.
This actually suggests another analytical approach to apply to these data sets. in forecasting, you can fill economic forecasting, you can fill several bookshelves with refinements on getting the next few wiggles. These things tend to have sort of a wiggle, 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 skip, wiggle, 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 drop, wiggle, 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 skip, wiggle, 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 drop behavior. And there's all this good stuff on how to forecast the next three wiggles if there's no skip and there's no drop. The fact is that in forecasting economic values, the skips and the drops are the interesting events. So possibly when we apply something like Lanchester square law to battles, why that was an anomaly may be the most interesting question on the data set.
Certainly, the inability of economists to forecast the future has been a topic of conversation. The late Queen Elizabeth II actually took economists to task and asked her why they had not forecast the crisis of 2008. That's a very fair question. But I think there is an answer in the problem that economics is about psychology and about the changing behavior of individuals and organizations. The organizations change because they develop in different ways under the incentives and constraints that are imposed on them. They will not necessarily react to a situation today as they would have reacted 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 100 years ago. And similarly, the behavior of governments is not the same. There are innumerable theories about economics, and different supporters believe different ones, sometimes for ideological reasons, but almost always in defiance of the evidence.
Sasha.
This is a smaller question, but out of all curiosity, you had mentioned how certain battles stand out due to Union artillery superiority. Does that hold up for the Confederacy with Chancellorsville?
I ruled out the initial Confederate assault by surprise at Chancellorsville, taking out the effects of that day. I concentrated only on the battle around the salient, the Fairview salient, on a particular date, which I can't for the moment recall, but I could look it up. So I focused on the forces engaged on that particular day around the Fairview salient.
And did Hazel Grove end up mattering as much as it's claimed it did?
Yeah. That bit. And that is another area where the power of artillery is quite important, and where a more complex analysis, including artillery separately from infantry, ought to be considered. But that's a bit above my pay grade.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Dr. Kirkpatrick, for almost a counterfactual presentation. You gave me something to think about, and one of my notes I just made to myself is to get your book. So you got me thinking.
That's very kind of you, and I look forward to being in contact with anybody who wants to follow up any of these points. Chris Lawrence has my email, and I'll be glad to hear from you. Good night.
All right.